it isn't normal to not have a cycle, and to be able to come to terms with that and, try and start taking the right steps to correct that.
11 years. I have gone 11 years without getting a monthly menstrual cycle. I spent years waking up in the morning, doing fasted workouts, doing lots of cardio, dramatically underfueling for my body's needs. After having a huge wake-up call that not having a period is not okay, I dove headfirst into the research on what I could do to get my period back. The research led me to discover a term called relative energy deficiency in sport. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today with Kyla Channell, who is a Degreed Performance Nutritionist who helps athletes get out of energy deficiency. If you are someone who loves to work out, who loves to be healthy and feel strong, and yet has lost her period, has gotten stress fractures, is feeling like her performance is declining, then this podcast is for you. Getting out of energy deficiency is key to long-term health. Your performance will decline on the short term. Your body will decline in the long term. So it is very important that if you are training on an energy deficit, that you learn just how important and necessary it is to be properly fueling your workouts for success. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump into the show because Kyla has a lot of information to share with you guys.
I don't give a
Kyla, I'm really honored and excited to have you on the show today. The topic that we are going to be talking about today, relative energy deficiency in sport and amenorrhea, is something that is near and dear to my heart, as it's something that I've suffered with for 11 years. And I'm currently still in my recovery, but this is something that I talk about a lot with my followers and the people listening to this show. So before we dive into this juicy topic, I do want you to just quickly introduce yourself, who you are, and what do you do in this world.
So my name's Kyla Channell, recently hyphenated Kyla Channell Jamat when a little compromise when I married my husband. And I got my degree at UC Davis in clinical dietetics. And then I actually did several internships while I was there, which is part of the kind of track you would get on to become a registered dietitian. And one of the kind of internships I ended up adding that's not included to the RD track was a sports nutrition internship, where I got to work under Dr. Liz Applegate, who is in charge of all the Division I sports nutrition, which once I got involved in that, I completely fell in love. And then following that, I actually got to work under Dr. Stacy Sims, where she actually kind of basically trained me to take over her position with a triathlon coaching company called Purple Patch. And in doing that, she obviously opened my eyes to all the sex-specific requirements in sport, which is something that was never touched on in school. And of course, being a little biased, a female myself, I just got sucked into that whole world and fell in love with that as well. And in doing that, it's just been such an eye-opener. And I do work with mostly triathletes, but also, really anyone in sport, and mainly females, but I do have my male athletes too. And we work with a lot of this stuff that we'll probably dive into a whole bunch of it, but I see, one of the common things is like underfueling. And that's something that of course can be something that leads to things like red S. So that's a little bit of my background.
Yeah, and I love how they coined the term red S, because this involves men now.
Yes.
And it's not just women who deal with energy deficiency. Men very much can deal with it, especially in sort of the triathlete sort of arena. I do want to mention before we dive into this that you don't have to be an athlete to be dealing with red S.
Right.
A lot of us are recreational exercisers. We love the gym, or we love hiking and trail running and all this stuff. And then we sort of fall into this trap of relative energy deficiency. And for many of us, we don't even really understand or know it. And we don't have coaches who are there being like, hey, you need to scale back on training. You need to increase fuel. I'm getting ahead of myself though. I want to ask you, what is Red-S? Can you explain it so that people who don't know what this is can sort of be following along here with this?
Yeah. So prior to Red-S, it was you bringing up the male component is like totally right on, and that's kind of why it got a little bit shifted too. Is like it was originally called the female athlete triad, and of course focusing only on females, which left men out of the picture. And of course, men were struggling with similar issues, obviously not losing their menstrual cycles, right? But similar issues in the sense of low energy availability and things of that nature. And so in 2014, I believe it was the IOC or the International Olympic Committee changed it to Red-S, which stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. And so kind of the main things that they're really looking at there are much more than just the triad three things. We're looking at low energy availability, potential underfueling. We're seeing things like immune system issues, changes in metabolic rate, loss of bone mineral density, even things like cardiac arrhythmia or bradycardia, or like psychological stuff like depression, things of that nature as well. And so it's much more than just the three things that it was originally focusing on, which I think is really important, that we kind of expand that. And then of course also include men into that as well.
What's really crazy and sort of scary about all of this is that a lot of these people who end up getting Reds, you would think are the healthiest people in the world. You know, I was exercising every single day. I was eating good, healthy food, very clean and all of that. And then all of a sudden I start reading on what can potentially happen. Increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of osteoporosis, of bone loss, of Alzheimer's, of Parkinson's disease, like all these things. I was like, what? How is me exercising and eating this way leading to all these very dangerous diseases that I thought I was protecting myself from?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really good that you bring all that stuff up, and a big piece of this. And I think we connected on having both read No Period, Now What? And they really dive into like trying to think about down the road, specifically obviously for women, what, like, do you potentially want to have kids, and like what is going on and what you're doing now that could impact that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 60 years from now, when you're older and your bone, you've lost a significant amount of bone mass and you're not producing hormones like you were when you're younger, or maybe you're not doing strength training to keep that kind of bone density around, and now you're just at higher risk of just folding the laundry and like having a stress fracture, and there was examples of that in the book. And it's scary to think about that, but it's also, I think it's really important that we educate people about that as well, so we can hopefully prevent that or overcome that before that point, right?
Exactly. I never want my clients to be scared when I talk to them, but I'm like, but this is the reality, and I wish I knew this before sort of jumping into this crazy exercise sort of routine that I had and not knowing how to fuel myself properly. Like, I wish I understood that I was losing bone loss and not building it, and that I was increasing my risk for heart disease and potentially also being infertile and not being able to have kids due to the lack of my menstruation. I'd love for you to give us sort of a little sort of snapshot. How does someone get Red-S, and what are the potential first signs that they start seeing?
Yeah, so good question. So I mean, one of the things that I'm always checking in with, and again, like specific to the community that I work with is a lot of endurance athletes, is like, I'm always checking in on like, how frequently are you even getting like colds? Like, is that something that's occurring frequently? Are you having, frequent little injuries? Those all to me tell me that there's not a proper balance going on in terms of like your energy output compared to your energy intake. And that can be even just the first signs right there, or even just little bits of like extended periods of fatigue, like you're not recovering from your whatever training or exercise that you are doing, can be kind of some early signs to kind of get on top of that the energy intake is not matching your energy output.
Yeah, and I think for a woman, one of the biggest signs too is a loss of menstruation. I think
Right.
that can be
Yeah.
sometimes the first thing to go for women, which
Hmm.
is a big sign. I would love for you to, trying to think, I have so many questions
Yeah.
here. So, so people are getting themselves in this state where they're completely out of an energy balance. So in order to be
Hmm.
healthy and in homeostasis, for everything to be working right, we got to be in an energy balance. But then people are dipping down, they're exercising too much, they're not fueling for that. So what do we start to do to get them back in a balance? And No Period Now, what Dr. Nicola Rinaldi, I loved that book. So I love that you mentioned that. And I saw it on your website too. She really recommends for people to cut out all exercise and to be eating a minimum of 2,500 calories a day. In particular, she's talking about getting your menstrual cycle back if you've lost
Right.
it. I'm always curious because I know Dr. Stacy Sims she doesn't necessarily say cut out all exercise. I know
Hmm.
she's really keen on this. Make sure you are fueling right enough, before and after. I would love to know your thoughts on this. And if you have a woman athlete who's coming to you, she's
Yeah.
exercising 7 days a week, she's maybe under fueling here, she doesn't have a menstrual cycle, she's had some stress fractures. What's the first step you take here with her?
Yeah. So the first thing we kind of do, we'll obviously gather all that information, right? And trying to get this picture of what's been going on and where she's struggling and also what are her goals, right? And then from there, we want to kind of try and get a picture of what her current level of intake is to like officially determine that she potentially is under fueling. And this is all unique, of course, to each individual, depending on the person. Some people don't want to like get a body fat test or a bone density reading. They're not comfortable doing that. So there's a starting place for each person depending on kind of where they are psychologically with it too. And so like if I have an athlete who's just kind of come to me and like out of the blue, they're like, yeah, like I stopped having my period last year and like I got a stress fracture in my foot and like I just want to make sure I'm like doing things right and like is totally on board and like motivated to kind of get going, which I think you also will see sometimes with folks who do have red S's. There's a lot of that sometimes like a bit of a competitive nature, which I think is where you'll like see that also overlap sometimes with sport, right? And so we will have that person get a DEXA. We'll actually get a DEXA body fat test. So we're getting bone density as well as body fat reading with that individual. And that will give us a really good idea of obviously one, what their bone density is and what kind of adjustments we need to make if we do need to make them. Typically, if someone's having stress fractures, we probably do need to make some adjustments nutritionally. And that might be looking at like their calcium, vitamin K, vitamin D sources in their diet and adjusting those as necessary. But then we're also looking at, hey, what does your training look like? Are you eating the same thing every day, even though on the weekends you're doing a 4-hour bike ride, but then during the week you're only doing an hour strength session or something like that? We need to make sure that we're matching a 4-hour bike ride day with that level of intake. And so that's something where in getting a DEXA body fat test, we're able to see what their lean mass is. And in determining their amount of lean muscle tissue, we can then determine what their resting metabolic rate is and be able to build from that platform. And there's also, of course, calculations like Mifflin St. Jeor and things like that, where you can calculate resting metabolic rate and things like that. But I think what's really important with someone who potentially has been under fueling is that it does have an effect on your metabolic rate, right? It'll depress it, right? Because your body is sensing this low energy availability and it wants to, of course, survive. So it's going to do anything that it can to help mitigate these losses so it can essentially survive, meaning it could be cooling your core temperature. It will decrease your fidgeting. It will hopefully increase your hunger signals too when you're decreasing your body fat that much as well. But so there's all these things your body will do to try and just continue to try and keep you alive the best it can. And also that would mean typically shutting down things that aren't high priority, like creating life, right? Or having a cycle. And so that would be, one of the things we would pay attention to too. And so, yeah, with my athletes, like, I think depending on the individual and what's going on, it's like, there will be some scenarios where it's suggested to not, exercise at all, and definitely monitor the types of intensity of exercise that is going on, because I think that's a big piece of it too. Is I see the mistake made a lot where a lot of people will try and do like HIIT or high intensity or intervals like 6 or 7 days a week, which is insane. Like, it's a lot of stress on your system when you're doing high intensity all the time. And so I think as an athlete and having a coach who's knowledgeable about that, doing your programming and making sure too that you are not doing high intensity all the time, that is maybe 2-3 days max in your training schedule that have bursts of high intensity, and the other days are light recovery, form focused drills where you're not just continuing to stress your central nervous system and expend an excess amount of calories that you're not matching. The other thing that's really common with endurance athletes I see is that in doing endurance activity, because of the elevations in the cortisol and the fight or flight hormones from high intensity or longer training sessions, is that their appetite becomes depressed for sometimes the whole rest of the day, which is a whole nother piece of the puzzle, right? And making sure that even though their appetite is not there, you still broke down quite a bit of muscle tissue and you depleted a significant amount of your glycogen stores. And so we need to make sure that we're, again, matching that. And particularly with women, the kind of window of opportunity for recovery following your training sessions is smaller than that of men's, meaning that we need to get in some protein and carbohydrates, ideally within 30 minutes would be great, to help turn down that muscle breakdown and start that reparation process.
Yeah. And what about pre-fuel for your workouts? This was something, so you mentioned a lot of people are doing intense HIIT workouts every day. And I think social media has really, unfortunately, sort of escalated this sort of addiction to exercise and the intensity, and I'm strong, I can do this. And we push through a lot of pain, especially when we are type A, athletic, competitive women, where I'm like,
Right.
oh, I can do this, and I don't even need breakfast and all that. So a mistake that I made, which after finding Stacy Sims, I was like, whoa, didn't realize that this was a big issue. I was doing fasted working out. I was fasting and working out every single morning. So I wouldn't eat until after my workout. And some days I would even wait 3-4 hours until after my workout, until I finally had that first meal. Can you please share the effects of doing fasted cardio or fasted working out on the hormonal system? Because that was really shocking to me, what was actually happening in my body.
Yeah. So I'll back up and say a lot of the research that's been done specifically on intermittent fasting and also a lot of low carb, high fat diets in terms of weight loss, a lot of that research has been done on men. So I think that's something that we have to be also kind of dig and ask some questions when we see something on, I don't know, women's health, and it's intermittent fasting, whatever it is, question that research, because a lot of times the journalists are just pulling kind of tidbits and not actually giving you the background. Or maybe it was done on rats. How does that relate to a woman without a cycle, or a woman depending on where she is in her cycle? So I think it's really important that we kind of question some of the research that's being put out there and try and specifically take information from research that has been done specifically on women. And I think that there's starting to become more and more of that out there, which is great. And Stacy's doing a fantastic job at getting that knowledge out there. And so with the kind of whole intermittent fasting, or even just going into a training session fasted, something that we really have to keep in mind, and especially if you're asking your body to go into a high intensity training session fasted, there's a whole other added piece to that puzzle as well, is that if we think about our cortisol hormone, which is our stress hormone, one of our stress hormones, I should say, and then we have melatonin, which is our sleep hormone, they should really in reality be cycling opposite of one another. So when we first wake in the morning, we have cortisol is peaking at its highest and melatonin should be its lowest. And then as we go throughout the course of the day, cortisol should be trending down and melatonin should be trending up, right? And what can end up happening kind of in today's society is we wake up, we have our elevated cortisol, it starts to trend down, but we have a cup of coffee, which is basically liquid cortisol. We keep it elevated. We go into a fasted training session. We keep the cortisol elevated. And so we end up keeping these fight or flight hormones, as well as adrenaline and norepinephrine, things of that nature, elevated. And in turn, those actually will signal storage of adipose tissue or increases in something called estrone, which is one of our three estradiol sex hormones. We have estradiol and estrone are the two that are acting. And so estradiol will depress and estrone will increase. And so estrone is responsible for increasing the storage of adipose tissue. And so we have that go up along with cortisol when we do fasted training like that. So not only are we increasing probably the likelihood that we'll store fat, but we're increasing the stress hormones, which in turn, increase our risk of heart issues down the line as well. But then we're thinking of if you are an athlete and trying to focus on performance, like you're likely not getting what you can out of your performance because you're going into it with no fuel on board, and you're just spiking these stress hormones, and then in turn potentially, like you're saying, not eating for several hours after the fact too, because your appetite might be depressed.
It's a vicious cycle. And then a lot of the times you're not sleeping well at night because your melatonin hasn't been going down or going up all day because your cortisol has been so high, and it can't be, they can't be high at the same time. It has to be one or the other. I was insomniac for 3 years. I slept maybe 3 hours, and then I'd wake up at like 5:30 in the morning to do a fasted workout, and you get yourself in a big mess. In particular for athletes or for people who are amenorrheic, who don't have their period, something that really shocked me was that when cortisol's high, your sex hormones are low. So your estrogen and progesterone. Meaning that like you're suppressing your ability to have estrogen in your body more and more, pretty much making it impossible for you to get your period back at that point. It's going to be really hard. I'd love for you to share the effects of estrogen in the body, because it's more than just not having a period. I was really shocked by how dangerous it can be to be in that state. So what are some of the other consequences that might sort of push people a little bit forward to start working on this and to be like, hey, not having a period's not okay?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we aren't having a cycle, one of the big things obviously we'll see drop is our estrogen production. And of course that estrogen production or being circulating in the system is going to be really important for that bone building component. And so a lot of times, like OBGYNs and things like that, if they see that you have low bone density, they might put you on an oral contraceptive or something like that. And what ends up actually happening by putting these, external exogenous hormones in your system is we actually don't necessarily see increased bone formation. We just see a decreased bone loss. So with the oral contraceptives, there's two things going on. There's bone breakdown going on and there's bone formation, and they're two different processes, right? And so what ends up happening is with the oral contraceptive, you are stalling the bone breakdown. You're not increasing the bone building. And so that's going to be kind of one of those key things with that, the estrogen in the system. And then, with if we, were to think of kind of we'll call it like what the research looks at is like a 28-day cycle where we have what we would break into two different phases. Would be like the low hormone phase would be like the first day of bleeding to ovulation, and the high hormone phase would be ovulation to the next time of bleeding. Is like we should be having fluctuations in things like estrogen and progesterone throughout those phases, and typically having a peak in estrogen and progesterone in that high hormone phase. And, obviously if we're not having a cycle, we're not seeing that occur. And so again, the bone losses and again, potential for stress fractures and things like that are going to be kind of the things we definitely want to be mindful of. And then of course, down the road or kind of longer term effects, we're talking about things like the heart disease, the bradycardia, heart arrhythmia. You might feel the pitter patter stuff going on in your heart. And that has to do also with some electrolyte imbalance stuff that can start to occur with decreased estrogen in the system as well. And then of course that would play a part if you were an athlete. If you have electrolyte imbalances, you're not going to be able to cool yourself, or you might have increased muscle cramping and things of that nature as well with the decreased estrogen.
So it's way more than just not having a monthly cycle.
Right. Yeah. And I actually I have had athletes who, one of them in particular, she told me she was not having a cycle, and she didn't think anything of it. She didn't think it was a concern. She thought it was almost a blessing in disguise. Like, oh, I don't have to deal with my period. Like, but what we ended up seeing with her is she was not improving in her performance. She was not recovering. Her strength was going down. Her lean mass was going down. And when we took a look at her daily intake of food, it was significantly low. She was absolutely under fueling. But she also, of course, has a very much of a fear of getting her cycle back and adding in all these calories. So it's a very kind of gentle balance that you have to approach with people or individuals in that situation.
What is your recommendation, or maybe I should ask it this way, if you were in this spot where you had been overtraining for a while, under fueling, hadn't had a period for say 3 years, would you jump into, okay, I'm going to go all in, I'm not going to exercise, I'm going to be eating my little heart out? Or is there a way that you can manage, all right, I'm going to keep exercise, maybe reduce the intensity a little bit, but make sure that I'm keeping up on fueling? Like, do you see that being a viable way to getting your period back? Or is it necessary to go sort of all in? I'm going to take out all exercise. And I know that every single experience is different, but
Right.
I'm just wondering, is there a chance where you can just be like, all right, we're going to work on refueling, I'm going to work on lowering intensity, but I'm going to still train and potentially get my period back?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. Like you can go either way with it. I think it really depends on the individual. So, I'll ask my clients, are you an all in kind of person, or are you a one thing at a time kind of person? Right. And so, and that comes down to like anything. It doesn't necessarily have to relate to bringing your cycle back too. It might just be like, if I want a client to increase their calcium sources, like, should I give you a whole list, or should I just say, hey, let's increase this one thing and check in on that once a week? Like, and it all depends on the client and what's going on in their life. And so if that person, is comfortable potentially waiting a longer period of time to get their cycle back and kind of needs to implement it slowly over time, that's something we can do. But of course, we want to make sure that those expectations are really clear, that it may take a longer time to get your cycle back. If you go all in tomorrow, like, by all means, I would imagine you would get your cycle back much faster than the person who's, really slowly progressing that way. But I also think you have to be really strong mentally to do that and be prepared for that and aware of, all the things that come with it, right? Is like, you might be kind of pushing some food down your into your mouth that you're like not necessarily hungry for, because you've trained your body to only take in so many calories for a period of time, and you might feel really full. And not exercising for a lot of people, or I should say exercising for a lot of people, is sometimes a place of stress relief for them, even though it's a stress relief maybe mentally, but you are increasing the physical stresses in your system, those cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, things like that. And so we have to be mindful of that too, is like, that could have been a place of like stress relief for them, and now we're kind of taking it away. So can we find other places and to kind of get that? Is it just light walking? Are we able to do 15-20 minutes of yoga even? Like, is that help you kind of get that breathing and like other ways to kind of bring some of those other stress hormones down, really?
A lot of doctors, if you go into the office, they'll just be like, oh, just stop exercising, gain weight. And to an athlete, we're like, what?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
like, there's such a psychological component to that.
Right.
It took me 11 years to get to the place where I could be like, I'm ready to go on. Like,
Yeah.
mentally, I can handle this. I canceled my gym membership. I started eating 4,000, 5,000 calories a day to try and restore my cycle. But oh my gosh, if you asked me 3 years ago to do this, I would be like, no.
Yeah.
And it would probably spur me back into relapse of, oh, I'm just going to train harder. I'm just going to eat less. And it really is a mind game. That's where working with someone also who understands sort of the psychological aspect and who can help you work through not only the physical things, but the emotional side that's going to come with it, I think is really key to have sort of that balance in this recovery sort of period.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you need that. A lot of people will need and want that support there. And I think, with the No Period Now book, is like, you see a lot of that support in that kind of like chat room, basically, or the board that they call it. They were able to kind of, no judgment, go in there and like express like all the things that's going on. Like, oh my gosh, I bent over and saw like rolls on my stomach, and I looked at it and I finally said, like, I love you. Like, that's great, you know, and being able to accept stuff like that. But yeah, working with a professional, I think is so important to kind of like help with that and have a community of people who can support you through this, because yeah, the mental part is really hard, and you are changing your whole mentality around the area. So it is a big shift.
But I want to give some inspiration and hope here to people.
Yeah.
Once you have, say you go on, you've increased your calories, you finally get that period back. Can you ever exercise again? I think that's a question a lot of people are like, but am I doomed to sitting on the couch and eating ice cream? Like, is there
right. Yeah. So I think, exercise is very important for health, right? But there can be the extremes, right? We can take the exercise too far and not enough fueling to support that, or vice versa. And then we can kind of get ourselves into that situation with red S or something like that, or amenorrhea. And so being able to, again, manage that. So like in, No Period Now What, she references like doing 2,500 calories a day is kind of the range they saw that worked really well for people. And then what she expands on is like, if you're going to do exercise and you do say an hour of exercise or something like that, you need to add in, 600 or so calories to, in addition to that 2,500. So you need to be at a 2,500 minimum and not continue to exercise and basically expend more calories than that you're taking in, right? And create that deficit that you were previously in. We wouldn't be, progressing forward if we were continuing to do that. So you do need to absolutely match that output in caloric intake the best you can with additional calories coming in.
So in other words, yes, you can get back to the sport that you love to do, but hopefully in a more mindful way of, and I don't want to say it this way, but how sensitive the body really is, especially us as women. Our bodies are very sensitive to energy output and energy deficiency. And so hopefully we can now go back into our sport with a better knowledge of, hey, that 4-hour bike ride is going to mean that I need to eat more. Right. Even though you're not hungry, and pushing yourself a little bit, recognizing that's like, it's not okay to just, oh, I'm strong, I can push through this and I don't need this. And being like, no, it's okay to eat. It's okay to refuel. I had a question for you, because again, with social media, there's so many new diet trends and things like that. And something that I see of huge popularity is the keto diet. And keto, for those of you who don't know, is when you're pretty much cutting out all carbs and you're eating a very high fat diet, some protein. Even things like fruit is too high in carb for keto. And so they recommend sticking to the lower glycemic index fruits like blueberries and things like that. But what is the effects that a ketogenic diet can have on women's hormones? Specifically, if we can talk about the necessity for carbohydrates, or the carbohydrate sensitivity, I should say, in women's bodies.
Yeah. So there is a kind of, and I think Stacy Sims mentioned this in her book Roar, is like there's a minimum of carbohydrate daily intake that is necessary for women that isn't necessarily applicable to men. And I believe it was somewhere in the range of like 100 to 130 grams minimum per day for normal sex hormone functioning. And then of course we expand on that depending on the individual and their size and their sport and, what they're asking of their body to do. Right. So, that, I believe keto is like 20 net grams of carbs or 30 net grams of carbs or less. Right. So it's like, that is like far off from that 130 gram minimum that we're looking at for women to support that. And so that is something where you're totally right. Like it's a lot of this like media and social media exposure to these like diet trends and things like that. And again, kind of jumping back to the research is like a lot of the research specifically looking at weight loss for low carb, high fat, or keto was done on men, where the men lost weight. But when we take that and apply it to women, we end up seeing weight gain. And again, that comes down to the stress hormones being elevated and that estrogen being elevated and increasing that signaling to the body to say, hey, store fat because I think I'm in a starvation mode. And so that becomes, again, very important to kind of be mindful of, that we need that minimum. And then when you look at it for an athlete's perspective, is that especially with endurance and anything that is high intensity, you're asking your body to go what we call glycolytic. And that means it's relying on stored carbohydrates in the muscle tissue for fuel, or glycogen. And so if you're not supplying your body with those things, it's going to likely be really hard to hit intensities and also recover from your training sessions or go long in training sessions. So yeah, the carbohydrates are going to be a huge piece into like keeping the sex hormones fluctuating and regular, but also performing in your sport at a level that you potentially want to perform at.
So eat your pasta.
Yeah, yes.
Eat noodles. They're not noodles. Yeah. Eat
right.
pasta. It's beneficial for you. You do need those carbs. That's something a lot of women who come to see me they're afraid of it. They are afraid of carbs. I don't know why we love to demonize different food groups in our society, and carbs has gotten a huge portion of the hate out there.
Yeah. That is something that I see as well. Is like there's not only is there a caloric deficit, but there is such a fear of carbs. And I think what's really important to be mindful of, and that I like try and educate my athletes on, is that when you increase your carb consumption, for every additional gram of carbohydrate, your body will pull in about 3 grams of water with it. And so people who are hopping on the scale regularly, they'll see, oh my gosh, I had a bagel yesterday and now I'm up a pound. It's like, well, that's probably water, like to not be so stressed out about that. And that's something where, if we're thinking about it as an athlete, the more fluid we have in the system, the better and more efficient we're going to be at cooling ourselves, creating sweat, things of that nature, and to go further in our performance. And once we get them realizing that and we see that, it makes such a big difference. And I will tell my athletes to just not hop on the scale, honestly, because it does very much mess with our minds. And once they feel that improvement in their performance, it's like night and day. And they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, like I don't need the scale. Like I know that's going to happen. Like I felt so good in my race. Like, so it is a big difference in kind of just, going with the process and like letting it occur and knowing what those expectations that might occur, and then kind of learning from that and just being able to hopefully happily repeat it down the road.
I love how you mentioned the hydration and the sweating, and I had a question, and this actually has come from multiple of the people that I see. We get them reducing their exercise, maybe even cutting out the gym for a month or so, totally reset emotionally, physically, everything. And I get them to do yoga. And then they come back and they're doing yoga sculpt and they're doing hot yoga. And I would love to hear your thoughts on how hot yoga in particular, how that affects the hormonal system. Is that something we should be doing in recovery? Can that be detrimental? Is it even something that, regardless of where we are at, whether we have amenorrhea or not, is that something that could be potentially dangerous to the human body to be in that heat 3-4 times a week?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, in regards to the amenorrhea topic, it's more stress to the system, right? So if you were to wear a Garmin watch or a heart rate monitor into something like a hot yoga class versus a non-heated class, you're going to see your heart rate much higher in that hot yoga class, right? So that means your heart's working harder. You're obviously sweating a significant amount. So you're losing a significant amount of fluids. If you're still in this recovery phase too, it's possible that your electrolytes are still in balance, and you're likely either going to feel really exhausted following that session if you don't properly replace your electrolytes, or you potentially might not be able to complete the session if you didn't go in with adequate electrolytes in your system or fluid balance. And so there's definitely that piece of it. There are places where, like, I will have my athletes do something called Sauna Protocol, which is obviously something that I likely wouldn't suggest to someone with amenorrhea. And that's where we're trying to like get them trained and their sweat glands basically trained, or sweat concentration rate trained for high heat or elevation training. But yeah, in the regards to like the amenorrhea stuff, I would think you're like you're absolutely expending much more calories in like an hour of hot yoga than you are in a non-heated class. So again, you would want to either up your calories for that, up your electrolytes for that, or not do it and do the unheated yoga, right? And kind of be a little bit gentler to your system in that recovery phase.
And I think it's understanding, okay, if I'm losing this much, I gotta be eating this much. If you can't eat this much, if that's too scary, if your body hates eating 4,000 calories a day, we gotta start going like, okay, well then maybe eat the 2,500, but lay chill on the intense exercise. So that, again, we're bringing our body back in this balance.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is all about that balance. So you're trying to kind of like get that teeter-totter in the right place, right? So.
Yeah. So what is the average time that you've seen with your athletes to get their period back after they start working on these protocols? Again, there's different lengths. They can go longer, they can go all in, but what's sort of the average time of, okay, we're increasing carbs, we're increasing calories, because we just discussed we need to be doing both. It's not just increase calories and be eating all protein. Please add in the breads and the pastas and the fruit and all of that. The reducing exercise, how long can that take for the hypothalamus to sort of kick back in and start sending out gonadotropin to the pituitary gland to send out FSH and LH to the ovaries to produce a period?
Yeah. So I will usually see with my athletes, it's somewhere between 3 and 8 months. And again, we're dialing in their intake throughout. If it's 8 months, we're going through potentially a race season where there's a lot of peak and high stress, and we're really making sure that we're matching the intake to support that. I had and actually an endurance or long distance or ultra endurance runner who lost her cycle, and she was the one we were actually able to get it back in 3 months, which was fantastic. And and ever since then we continued. Once we now have a regular cycle, we're also continuing to support her performance depending on now where she is in her hormone cycle too. So again, kind of those effects that will occur depending on whether you're in that low hormone or high hormone phase, and how that affects your athletic performance and recovery. And now nutritionally, how do we support that and continue to keep the cycles regular while still doing her sport?
I love that.
Yeah.
So much good information. If you are struggling with relative energy deficiency, you're not sleeping well, you have the stress factors, brain fog, you're not building muscle mass, you're decreasing in your performance. There's so many other sort of symptoms of relative energy deficiency. If you don't have your period, start looking into it. Reach out to Kyla if you need help in how much do I need to be eating? How much am I actually expending with my workouts? Because I think that's something that we can have a skewed perspective on, or not even skewed. We just don't really understand that, like, hey, that hour-long bike ride, it may have seemed easy to you, but that could have been expending a huge amount of calories. And working with a professional like you're able to see like, whoa, this is what's going on. How can our followers find you?
So I'm on Instagram at Nutritional Revolution, and I have a website. You can also link it through obviously Instagram, but website at www.nutritional-revolution.com. Or you can Google my name, Kyla, Kyla, Channell, Channell.
Beautiful. Any last parting thoughts for our listeners?
I think, the really big thing is like understanding, like trying to come to terms like that it isn't normal to not have a cycle, and to be able to come to terms with that, and try and start taking the right steps to correct that. Because I think, again, a lot of women will be like, oh, like it's something that it almost is like a success to them in a sense, where like if they haven't had their period for a time, they like don't have to worry about it and all that stuff. And it's like, that really is like, we need to shift our mindset there. And I think it's really important to kind of be aware of that again, it's not a normal thing to occur, and we want to kind of regulate that. And when it comes to the athlete side of things, it's like having your period is actually an ergogenic aid. Like it helps your performance, and of course having your cycle as a non-athlete, it's very important to our health now, but in the long term as well. So, trying to kind of just start to take the first steps to hopefully kind of move in the right direction for your health is really important.
Beautiful. I loved that. I loved everything today. I think that was a wealth of information. A lot of people haven't heard of the Red S. They're familiar with female athlete triad. There's way more going on with that. So hopefully this gave them a good sort of push to start doing more of their research and to start fueling more, and maybe chilling out a little bit on the intense exercise until your body can heal.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Kyla, for joining
No
the
problem.
show. This was such a pleasure.
Wow, I hope you guys got a lot out of that podcast. In the end of the day, you learned that it is extremely dangerous for a myriad of reasons to be training on an energy deficit. Energy deficit most likely is going to be happening when you are underfueling and overtraining. So, in order to restore energy balance, it's going to require you to reduce or completely eliminate your workouts and increase your calories. Daunting, I know. If you guys need help with this, please reach out to me, contact me. My information is below. If you are interested in working with Kyla, if you are an athlete and you want to improve your performance, reach out to her. You can find the link to her website below as well. I hope you guys subscribe to my channel so that you can get the next podcast with the next expert that I'm going to be interviewing on how to fully recover from an eating disorder. Have a great day, guys.
Making a fool of me. Don't make no mistake loving you. But if you're running around on me, let me spell it out for you.